Hello everyone, Tom with Capo Fetish. Today on the channel, we're going to talk about 10 5-star debut albums from the 1980s. Of course, this is purely subjective. I'm going to count them down though from 10 to number 1. So I feel that these albums here, these 10 albums, really represent almost a perfect album. From start to finish, there's really barely a hint of filler, if any. So let's start it off here with 1983's Violent Femmes. Their first album for Slash Records. The story goes is that guitarist James Honeyman Scott from the Pretenders saw Violent Femmes on a street corner in Milwaukee busking, and it just so happened that the Pretenders were playing across the street. This is 1981. Pretenders were playing across the street at some theater, and James Honeyman Scott, just before the show, before the Pretenders came on, happened to notice these guys playing on the street, loved them so much. In fact, Chrissie Hynde invited them to play on stage that night after the opening act. So by just purely word of mouth, James Honeyman Scott was able to get these guys signed to indie label Slash Records. So recorded mainly, I think, the latter part of 1982. Most of the songs on this album were just huge songs on alternative stations like K-Rock back in the day. Still are, I believe. Songs like Blister in the Sun, how many times have you heard that, right? That's been played in several movies. Kiss Off, Please Do Not Go, Add It Up, Confession, Prove My Love, love that track. Promise, To the Kill, Gone Daddy Gone is another favorite of mine. And then Good Feeling, 10 songs and about 30 minutes long too. One of those short but sweet records. When I heard this album, the first thing I thought of was maybe Jonathan Richman, like, Jonathan Richman, not the original Modern Lovers, but, the more naive kind of whimsical Jonathan Richman. But this is more like Jonathan Richman with an edge. And it's lasted. It has just a lot of lasting power through the decades. And I think it's fantastic. And there's really not a single track on here that I feel is bad. Violent Femmes coming in at number 10 for me from 1983. Coming in at number 9 is a band to me that they've switched a lot of styles throughout the years. They've done jazz, they've done cocktail jazz, they've done electronica, but I really love their first 2 albums, especially their first one, their debut. This is Everything But the Girl, and their album Eden came out in 1984. Just a perfect record. First of all, it features just one of the most incredible singers of her era. And that is Tracy Thorn, just gorgeous voice. We have her husband, Ben Watt, they both write the songs. They have other musicians back them up. So on this first album here, you have a really nice mixture of kind of cocktail lounge jazz, pop, a little bit of twangy guitar, a little bit of maybe jangly guitar as well. It's a really unique combination of styles, but it all really works. This is the UK version of their first album called Eden. In America, it was put out as this right here, just Everything But the Girl. And the interesting thing about this particular release is that the first side on the American release here has all the songs, or at least 6 of the songs from the album Eden. And then side 2 is a completely different sequence of songs that weren't even on Eden. I think that were just, maybe this record was more tailor-made for the US market. So basically all of side 2 are completely different songs that were not on Eden. And these, I would say this along with Eden, either or, are both 5-star records. They're both incredible. I think side 2 of this US version though has some really great tracks. The first one called Never Could Have Been Worse is really kind of slow and kind of gothy sounding. Has this kind of twangy guitar. Another one called Laugh You Out the House. Another one called Mine. Easy as Sin, Native Land, and Riverbed Dry are all fantastic. Not included on Eden. Both amazing records featuring the amazing Tracy Thorn on vocals. I also love their second album from 85 called Love Not Money. I find that is another just perfect record, but nobody really talks about these early Everything But the Girl records. When they think about most of the population, when they think of Everything But the Girl, it's always more the electronica stuff they did at the end of the 90s. Like Missing, those kind of things, which is cool. But I really love these early Everything But the Girl albums. I remember seeing Everything But the Girl at the Wiltern Theater back in 1990. They were promoting the album The Language of Life, which is really more kind of low-key, kind of Sade style kind of jazz. Great album, and it was just an amazing show with amazing musicianship, and her voice, Tracy Thorn, was just absolutely stellar. So number 9 for me is Everything But the Girls, Eden, and its U.S. counterpart, just titled Everything But the Girl. Coming in at number 8 is one of my favorite bands from the 80s. I must have saw these guys maybe 6 or 8 times from about 88 through the mid-90s. I'm talking about the Smithereens and their first album called Especially For You, released originally on the Enigma label, which is a subsidiary of Capitol. Still has the hype sticker here. I bought this in 1986. If you could look closely, you could see how cheap albums were back then. $5.99. Pretty amazing. I bought this album at Moby Disc along with another band I never heard of called Game Theory. And the album was called The Big Shot Chronicles. I remember it was just a double win for me coming home that night with both those records, just both excellent records. So back to the Smithereens, especially For You. This is their first major label debut. It is just it's like a kind of a homage to kind of British invasion style music with more of an 80s updated sound. The big hit on here was Blood and Roses, a song that my band back in the day used to cover. We did a really cool version of it. There's so many great tracks on here. You have kind of an Elvis Costello vibe on the track called Behind the Wall of Sleep, which just rocks. Pat Denizio, the late Pat Denizio was just a great, solid 3-minute hook songwriter. I remember meeting him before a show at the Ventura Theater back in '88. The nicest guy. He invited us backstage after the show, but I think I was with somebody who needed to get back quickly after the show, so we never did really hang out with the Smithereens, but talked to him at a coffee shop. Super, super cool guy, and it's a shame that we lost him early, but every track on here is amazing. Strangers When We Meet, Listen to Me Girl, Groovy Tuesday, Cigarette, I Don't Want to Lose You. Side 1 ends with Time and Time Again, which was a great live number. One of my favorite tracks on here is the ballad called In a Lonely Place. We have Suzanne Vega on backup vocals. Gorgeous track. Blood and Roses, of course, Crazy Mixed Up Kid, Hand of Glory, and one of my absolute favorite tracks on the album, ending the album, called Alone at Midnight. So good. There's just not a bad track on here. It's fantastic. They also released other great albums after this, like Green Thoughts and 11, but for me, this will always be my favorite Smithereens album, and I'm putting this at number 7. Smithereens, Especially For You from 1986. Coming in at number 7 is the U.S. debut from The Church, just called The Church. The imported UK counterpart is Of Skins and Heart, but I think this one is the definitive version of the first Church album. It incorporates a lot of the singles they had and puts them all in this collection along with other album cuts. It's just an absolutely stellar record from start to finish. Starting off with The Unguarded Moment, which should have been a huge hit here in America, but it was not. I mean, it just reeks of just great hit. Too Fast For You is another, just could have been another hit. For a Moment We're Strangers, great kind of ballad called Tear It All Away, which has these chimey guitars. I love their sound on this first album. Very birdsy, very mid-60s psychedelia. The last track on side 1 is kind of a piano-driven ballad called Don't Open the Door to Strangers, which is just fantastic. And then side 2, we have Bel Air starting off, and then a song that wasn't on the counterpart of Skins and Heart, a track called Sisters, which is really cool. And then it rounds up with Memories in Future Tense, and then the long track, Is This Where You Live, which was a great song. They did live when I saw them back in 1984. I think this album is just stellar. I think it's timeless sounding. If you've never heard this US version, try to find it, try to pick it up. I think it's been out of print for years, but I'm putting these guys at number 7 on my list. This is a 5-star album, The Church, their debut, and this came out in 1982 in the US. Coming in at number 6 is one of the greatest examples of ska, pop, that whole movement with the Specials, Madness. This is a 5-star record right here. The English Beat, I Just Can't Stop It. Absolutely perfect from start to finish. And one of the most uplifting records you will ever hear. featuring Dave Wakeling on vocals, Ranking Roger. You got Saxa on saxophone. A couple of the guys that went on to form the Fine Young Cannibals on guitar and bass. Just fantastic. Mirror in the Bathroom, great alternative hit. Hands Off, She's Mine, Two Swords, Twist and Crawl, Tears of a Clown. They do a great version of that. Rough Rider, Click Click, Ranking Full Stop, which I don't think is on the CD version of this, which starts side 2. Big Shot, Wine and Grind, Stand on Margaret. Noise in This World, Can't Get Used to Losing You. Fantastic cover. Best Friend and Jackpot. This is a perfect record right here from 1980. Just so many great albums came out in 1980. So this is one of them. So The English Beat, I Just Can't Stop It, coming in at number 6 for me on my 5-star 1980s debut albums list. All right, now we're down to the top 5. Okay, these probably are probably five of the most important albums for me personally from the 1980s. Number 5 is an album that I was obsessed with for a couple of years, from about 81 to 83. It was recorded in late 1980. I didn't discover it till about February 81, a few months after it was released. And once I saw this band live, I only played this album a couple of times before I saw this band live. When I saw this band live, I became a super fan for a couple of years. And this album was probably one of my most played albums during the early 80s, throughout high school. I'm talking about U2, their first album. Boy, this is the perfect example of a perfect album, perfectly sequenced. Every track makes sense as far as just melody, atmosphere. There was really nothing that sounded like this when it came out. The Edge, a true trailblazer for alternative rock guitar. Nobody sounded like The Edge, and nobody sounded, I mean, what was coming out of that guitar live was unbelievable. It sounded like several guitars. Early U2, I think people who only hear or only came into U2 with like Joshua Tree, Unforgettable Fire, Rattle and Hum, I think there's only a few out there that really know what I'm talking about when I say they were one of the most amazing live bands from around 81 to 83. Just incredibly powerful, like The Who almost. I know it sounds unbelievable, but when I saw them live, I saw them 3 times in 1981. I saw one of their first LA shows. It was in Reseda, California at the Country Club in March of 81. It blew my mind. I went back to high school that next day, told everybody about it. No one wanted to hear about it. Everybody kept telling me, no, man, REO rules and Journey and blah, blah, blah. But no one wanted to hear about U2. 7 years later, they're the biggest band on the planet. I don't think they ever made a better album than this. Everything from I Will Follow to Shadows and Tall Trees is an absolute masterpiece. The way it was recorded too is just brilliant. Steve Lillywhite, incredible producer, especially during 1980. He produced this album. He produced the Melt album by Peter Gabriel, and he produced Black Sea by XTC. Just all 3 killer records. But yeah, this to me is not only one of the greatest debut albums in the 80s. I think it's one of the greatest debut albums of all time. I haven't been a fan of U2 for 40 years. I haven't cared for really anything they've put out for decades. But this one will always hold a place in my heart as a special time in my life when I was a teenager. And I played this thing to death. And I think it's timeless. I think it's just really amazing record. U2 Boy, coming in at number 5. And again, along with the Country Club performance that I saw, I also saw them at the Santa Monica Civic with Suburban Lawns opening for them. Then I saw them later in the year when they released October at the Palladium, and that was when Romeo Void opened for them. So I saw them 3 times in 81, and that was probably the most times I've ever seen a band in 1 year at that point in time. So incredible stuff. U2 Boy, coming in at number 5. Coming in at number 4 is just an incredible debut. You know, when you think about the early 80s, especially early 80s alternative, a lot of synthesizer bands going on in the UK, Depeche Mode, Bronski Beat, OMD, I mean, you name it. It was just infiltrated with just so much watered down synth music, and then out comes this album here, bringing it back to the basics. The Smiths' debut album is really a milestone in alternative rock. It came out in 1984. They had a few singles released earlier before this in 1983, like This Charming Man. This debut album, really nothing sounded like it when it came out. First of all, you had this really unique original guitarist in Johnny Marr, playing a lot of arpeggios and chime, You have a really solid rhythm section with Andy Rourke on bass and Mike Joyce on drums. And of course, you have like just a brilliant lyricist in Morrissey at this point in time, talking about a lot of controversial subjects, dealing with sexuality and dealing with just like, you know, deep, deep, dark subjects, but also throwing in a little bit of this humor too. He had a lot of bit of humor in his writing. So, I mean, it starts off with Reel Around the Fountain. You've got Everything Now, Miserable Life, featuring just this long, long soprano from Morrissey. And Pretty Girls Make Graves, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, This Charming Man, Still Ill, Hand in Glove, What Difference Does It Make, I Don't Owe You Anything, Suffer Little Children, About the Moors Murders. Not real great subject matter in a song, but it's the music that carries it. Johnny Marr completely carries the song through with the most amazing guitar playing. I prefer the Hatful of Hollow compilation that came out soon after this. I think I like a lot of the versions on that better than this album. I think this might be a little overproduced, but as a debut album, it is an absolute 5-star masterpiece. Every track is amazing. And I mean, honestly, I think that Smiths, except for maybe just a handful of songs, they really never wrote a bad track. All their singles were amazing. Their B-sides, their outtakes, all 4 studio albums. Incredible band. The Smiths debut from 1984. Coming in at number 3 is one of the great early LA bands debuts, and that is X Los Angeles. Incredible band. I think they stand worlds apart from what was going on in the scene back then. They had songwriting chops. They had amazing harmonies with John Doe and Exene, an incredible guitarist in Billy Zoom, and you had DJ Bonebreak just playing just solid drums. Every track on here is amazing. Produced by Ray Manzarek, one of the great debuts in LA rock. And there's no need for me to keep going on about it. I've talked about this album many, many times throughout this channel's history. But I will throw this at you. I don't know if anybody has read this, but I highly recommend this. This Under the Big Black Sun, A Personal History of LA Punk, written by John Doe. This came out a few years back. This is a fantastic read with a lot of testimonials from the scene back then, like Jane Wiedlin from the Go-Go's. Of course, you have John Doe on here. All the people that were into the scene or part of that scene in the early 80s punk movement. Great read. You could probably read it in a full day. It's fantastic. Coming in at number 2 is an album that really changed my life in 1983. I became a huge follower, huge fan of this band for a good 3-4 years. I'm talking about REM's debut, Murmur, came out in 1983. Again, nothing really sounded like this at the time. This was an American alternative rock band. This is kind of the beginning of college rock. And this just really stood the test of time, this album. It features those chimey guitars, which never sound dated. I remember when I bought this at Moby Disc back in the day, the guy said, "Oh, it sounds like the Byrds." So I was like, "Oh, amazing. I'll pick it up right now." So every track is amazing. And I think that what really stands out too is Michael Stipe isn't enunciating like he would in later albums. That gives it this kind of mystique. What is he talking about? It's kind of like a cut and paste approach to the lyrics. They obviously have songwriting chops. They're all getting credit for the songwriting on this album. And it's just an amazing album. It has an incredible vibe. Moral chaos, shaking through, talk about the passion, laughing. It's just a masterpiece. So this is coming at number 2 for me, REM's Murmur from 1983. Number 1 shouldn't be any surprise to anybody who's watched this channel the past year and a half or so. An album that really changed my life in 1980, early 1980. I was 14 going on 15. And this kind of pretty much started my whole love of 1980s alternative music. This is not only my favorite debut from the 80s, it's my favorite album of the 80s, and it's in my top 10 albums of all time, and I'm talking about The Pretenders' first album. This is the epitome of a perfect album right here, from start to finish. Side 1 just rocks from start to finish. From Precious through Stop Your Sobbing by the Kinks, it's just a tour de force. Side 2 is more the mellow side with Kid, Private Life, Brass and Pocket, Lovers of Today, Mystery Achievement. Some of these tracks just never get old. Up the Neck, Tattooed Love Boys, The Phone Call, The Wait, Space Invader. Chrissie Hynde, an all-time hero of mine. This band here, just absolutely killer. You got Martin Chambers, just as absolutely solid as a rock drummer. Pete Farnan on bass, the late Pete Farnan, and one of the one of the great unsung guitar heroes of all time, James Honeyman Scott, who had influenced so many alternative guitarists like Johnny Marr and on and on. But when I first heard Precious, I could not believe what I was hearing when I was 14. That sexy voice of Chrissie Hynde, incredible, just blew my mind. And I'd never get tired of this album. This is still one of my most played albums of all time. And speaking of Chrissie Hynde, I don't know if anybody's read this book, but this is a real great rock and roll read. This is Reckless, My Life as a Pretender. This came out, I think, within the past 10 years. And I tell you, Chrissie has lived it and lived it like no other. And you have to read this book. I mean, she is a true trailblazer and the real deal. You got to read this book. It's amazing. So if it's still out, Chrissie Hynde's Reckless book. So there you go, folks. Those are my 10 5-star debut albums from the 1980s. Do you have any more to throw into the pot? Throw them in the comment section. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.